Lane. So I'm Andy Meyer. I'm a forester with the Army Corps of Engineers in the St. Paul district. And after all these talks about northern Minnesota with lots of pictures of snow, we're going to take a little trip to the tropics here and go to southeast Minnesota and even cross the border into Wisconsin and look at some areas with a lot of green in them. So I'm going to be giving a presentation on two case studies that we have in the Great Lakes Silviculture Library on two floodplain forest sites that we manage in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the two sites are the first one's at the on Corps-owned land within the Boers Wildlife Management Area in Mississippi River Pool 3, which is just north of Red Wing. And then the second site is in Mississippi River Pool 8, just south of La Crosse, Wisconsin. It's on a site that we manage with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Both of these sites are sites that have had no prior management, at least since federal acquisition in the 1930s. The Pool 3 site was a planned harvest, and the Pool 8 site was a salvage operation after a blowdown. And so what I'm going to do with these two case studies is kind of compare and contrast some of the similarities and differences between the two of them, and hopefully give you a little bit of insight into some of the challenges associated with managing floodplain forests. So the first site, I'll kind of go through a little summary of the Pool 3 site and then go on to the Pool 8 site. This was a site that was harvested in 2013, February of 2013. The inventory data for the site actually was pretty old at that point, from 93. One thing I'd point out is that floodplain forest stands can carry a lot of basal area. So this stand had about 90 square feet of basal area at the time of the harvest. But according to our stocking charts, that was still only about 50% stocking. We tend to shoot for more like 120 to 160 square feet of basal area. And this is important because you can kind of see in this area a little bit that there's a lot of openness in that canopy already in 2010 prior to harvest. So this project was set up kind of as a collaborative project with a couple other entities to test out some different techniques for regenerating floodplain forests. So we had a shelterwood cut, a series of half-acre to 2-acre group selections or patch cuts, depending on who's interpreting the terminology, and then a 16-acre clear cut. Within the patch cuts, we did herbicide application, follow-up herbicide application, and then within the clear cut, we actually had 4 different kind of post-harvest site prep scenarios where we combined herbicide application and soil scarification, along with no treatment controls. And so a lot of pictures here. Pictures can tell a lot about what's going on. So these are pictures from the patch cuts or the group selections. And one thing I want to point out here is this is post-harvest, what the sites look like. We didn't actually do any pre-harvest vegetation control. And I think that's potentially really important. With that open canopy that we already had on this site, that reed canary grass that was there was already really well established. So we didn't do any site prep until after the harvest, but in June of 2013 we did herbicide work, and we did all of the site scarification with a fecon head on a bobcat, which may not have really dug too deeply in, but it worked up the top of the soil a little bit. Sites are planted, also planted with just run-of-the-mill bare root seedlings in June of that year. And there was also a lot of maple seed on the ground. You can't really see it, but probably from a distance, but there's a lot there. One of the big challenges of floodplains is that they're really nutrient-rich sites, and there's vegetation that can grow like mad on them. So even with the herbicide work that we did by the fall of that year, we already had quite a bit of vegetation back in the site, different vegetation. Not necessarily always reed canary grass. We also had cottonwood seedlings and maple seedlings coming in. So let's fast forward to 2020 in those patch cuts. And I'm not going to get into what I think the differences are here until the end of the presentation. But by 2020, those patch cuts had pretty much gone back to reed canary grass. So I can hardly find a single planted tree seedling in those patch cuts. And we had some natural regeneration occurring, and every year we went out there, we thought this is going to be the year that it takes off, and then it never quite did. And as of last year, those patch cuts are basically failed regeneration treatments, as far as I'm concerned. Within the clear cut area, it's actually a pretty similar pattern. These pictures are showing the differences between the herbicide and no herbicide treatments. One thing that's really obvious is that you need to do some sort of vegetation control in these sites in order to have any hope of regenerating anything. This is pigweed that was probably 5 to 6 to 7 feet tall before it flopped over like that. On the top is reed canary grass. What's interesting though is in 2015, these are the herbicide areas, and we have natural maple seedlings in there, but that's 2 years post-harvest. And those seedlings aren't more than about 6 inches tall. They're only 1 or 2 year old seedlings, and they're not really happy seedlings either. So even with all of the herbicide or with the vegetation control, we weren't really getting successful regeneration in those spots. One thing that we did do is we came back into those control areas, having recognized that they were what we expected, regeneration failures in the clear cut. And in late summer and fall of 2018, we had 2 broadcast herbicide applications to control that reed canary grass. And it's maybe a little hard to tell, but in this picture, as of 2020, we have probably, I'm guessing we didn't actually do any regen plots in there yet, but probably between 1,500 and 2,000 cottonwood stems per acre with willow mixed in, and there's even a little bit of native swamp milkweed and other nice stuff kind of coming up in there. And then we have a lot of these kind of clumpy pockets of silver maple regenerating as well within that site. Okay, switching over to the other site, I'll bring these two together kind of at the end. So this is a little bit older harvest. This was done following a blowdown in 1998. The actual salvage was done in 99, the summer and fall of 99 and into winter of 2000. This was a much denser site to begin with and a much younger site. It's about 40 years younger than the previous site and much lower average stand diameters. I don't think I mentioned on the previous one, it was about a 26-inch QMD on the first site. And here we're looking at not even a 10-inch QMD. So we've got much smaller, younger trees here on this site. But it was blown down in 1998. And then we sort of initiated a number of site prep treatments and herbivory control treatments. Not going to read every detail here, but basically we had kind of 2 phases of the site prep treatments. The first phase was kind of from 2000 to 2006 and really focused on grass specific herbicides. And one thing that was quickly realized with that is that grass specific herbicides have really particular windows that they need to be applied. And in floodplains, when it floods, you oftentimes can't apply herbicides in very specific windows. So we kind of, by 2006, we'd realized that it hadn't worked. And starting in 2007, we initiated a project with University of Wisconsin-La Crosse to actually more formally test some different site prep treatments. And really what these mainly amounted to was application of fall applications of oust for 3 growing seasons during this assessment, and then kind of scattered applications of a variety of other herbicides as needed. And so what came out of this is we actually did get pretty substantial maple regeneration on this site. The graph on the right, I think the only thing that you really need to pay attention to is that basically the left bar in each one of these figures is the no herbicide treatment, and basically across all years there's basically no regeneration within no herbicide treatments. And then in the herbicide treatments, pretty much all of the herbicide treatments have pretty substantial regeneration and no significant differences between the herbicide treatments. The other thing I'll note is a scale. Yes, we are talking about 100,000 to 200,000 seedlings per acre when all is said and done in these sites, when they regenerate the way that they're supposed to. One thing that was really interesting here is that in 2007, we had basically no regeneration. And going back into the old notes from that point in time, because I wasn't actually around then, there was apparently, they had a hard time finding maple seed because they were trying to manually seed maple. And so actually, I think 2007 was probably a poor maple seed year. And so that could be as much of an explanation for why there wasn't good seed taken that year. So we also had some herbivory treatments installed. We've talked a lot about deer, and deer are definitely a problem in a lot of places. And so a couple different exclosure types, these really small exclosures and larger ones. And at least initially, it looked like, you can tell in the small exposure, that the seedlings around the outside of it are shorter and have been browsed. And I think there was a significant impact of deer browse on seedling height. But in this figure, which is from 2010, the blue lines are sort of outline where the exclosures are. And you can see that there is a lot of regeneration between the deer exclosures. And maybe there's some impact in height, but this is successful regeneration here, regardless of whether or not you have deer browse on it. So kind of pulling it all together, this site, we do have successful regeneration in places, but it's sort of spotty. In some places we have really good regeneration, some places we don't really have that great regeneration. It definitely seems like we only got regeneration where we did herbicide treatments, but the impact of the deer exclosures is really variable. And this is the site in August 2015, so 8 years post the first round of the phase 2 treatments, and those are seedlings that are probably 10 to 15 feet tall at that point, and definitely well established. So, kind of to compare the two sites, the Pool 3 site is actually these are inundation maps, and basically brown is very short period of inundation every year, and greens and blues are inundated for a long period every year. And so you can see the Pool 3 sites are actually a lot drier in terms of average annual inundation than the Pool 8 sites, which are kind of in this area here. But what I think is really important to note here is that the period of the regeneration period in which these two things occurred is very different. This bottom graph here is the annual hydrograph for river flows through Lock and Dam 10, which is the southern end of the St. Paul district. And so it reflects how much water was going through the entire Mississippi River from above Guttenberg, Iowa. And so the period that we were regenerating the Pool 8 sites was a lower than average period. And the period that we were regenerating the Pool 3 sites was a period of record high flows. And so even though this is generally a higher elevation site, the years in which we were trying to regenerate it happened to be some of the wettest years we've ever seen. And this little box at the end, which was after we did that follow-up herbicide treatment, the controls, what I don't have here are the 2020 and 2021 hydrographs, which are actually back down to normal or below normal. And so I think one of the biggest, kind of the two biggest takeaways here is that the annual hydrograph is a really critical thing for determining success or failure with natural regeneration in these floodplain sites. And 2 or 3 years of good conditions may be all that it takes for a site to be successful, but 1 year of bad conditions can completely ruin any attempts at salvaging regeneration on that site. And the other thing is that vegetation control is absolutely critical, and getting bare mineral soil is critical for getting light-seeded tree species established. So again, effective site prep is absolutely critical in these systems. I'm learning to think of these sites a little bit differently. Like if I have patches of successful regen and patches where there isn't, that's almost becoming to me, I'm starting to understand that this might be how this system actually works, that we might not be in a world where I can expect to see uniform regeneration across the entire site. Deer browse is a factor, but there's a lot more going on in these sites. And I think soil saturation and site inundation is really the biggest driver. And I think what's really challenging with managing these floodplain sites is we've got to adjust our mindset to think about the fact that we might fail for multiple years. And we need to be able to position ourselves to be able to come into a site and make sure that that site's ready to capture seed at the right time of the year for multiple years until we get the right conditions in a given growing season. I didn't mention the sale revenues in those two slides. You notice the one in 2013, we got $5,000 for 200,000 board feet. I'm sure I don't have a number, but I'm sure we've spent $20,000 to $30,000 trying to regenerate that site. There's no way that these floodplain systems are going to pay for, that sale revenues are going to pay for regeneration in most cases on these sites. I do have here that you probably shouldn't expect to capture sites with planting seedlings, but I do want to caveat that. We planted run-of-the-mill bare root seedlings just straight from the nursery. I think a lot of the things that Austa and Marcelo were talking about yesterday, looking at using larger stock types and really targeting your stock types really improves your potential for capturing the site with planting. Then my last slide is just a quick little plug. We have a lot of contracts that we put out every year. So if there are any contractors or consultants out here who want to work on the Mississippi River, give me a call. We're really trying to reach out and broaden our scope with contracting, because we've got a lot of work coming up in the next couple of years and not a lot of people bidding on it. So with that, I think I'll call it good. Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Next up is Gwen Keller.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gwen Keller, and today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about my study looking at the effects of flooding and shade on survival and performance of potential replacement species in black ash wetlands. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Cool. So first off, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this project, Robert Slazak, Justin Bronson, and Marcella Windmuller Campione. And we received funding from the Wisconsin DNR, the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources, U.S. Forest Service, and the Minnesota Forest Resources Council. So you all are already familiar with emerald ash borer. I just want to emphasize kind of what already Carrie Pike brought up today, that black ash is particularly vulnerable to emerald ash borer, and for that reason, black ash wetlands are particularly vulnerable, because in these wetlands, black ash dominates the canopy cover and acts as a foundational species, impacting hydrology, nutrient cycling, and wildlife habitat. And for this reason, because these wetlands are so vulnerable, researchers and managers are already looking at management strategies to address the problems that are going to arise when emerald ash borer shows up in these wetlands. One of the strategies that has been found is changing the stand structure. So using, for example, group selection harvests to change the stand structure, like I said, to encourage natural regeneration of non-ash species, or the planting of potential replacement species to introduce new diversity in the regeneration. So there have already been several studies looking at potential replacement species. This table that I borrowed from D'Amato et al. 2018 outlines some of the species that have already been studied and where they're recommended in the lake states. And I've highlighted in yellow the species that we looked at in our study. So all of these studies are critical to the effort of finding potential replacement species. However, one limitation is that all of them have been done in the field. So, and that's great, but the limitation is that sometimes it can be hard to determine why or why not a species survived in a black ash wetland out in the field. So like, for instance, it might be due to cold tolerance or flooding intensity or browse or something like that. So we're really in need of a controlled study that looks at these mechanisms. And that's where our study comes in. So kind of along the same lines as the other studies that I've talked about, our goal is to provide guidance to managers on what tree species are viable options for reforestation in black ash wetlands. And our specific objectives are to conduct a controlled experiment looking at flood intensity tolerance and shade tolerance for all of our study species. So we looked at 23 different species. And since I only have 15 minutes today, I won't be able to talk about all of them. But I highlighted in orange the ones that I'm going to mention today. And before I get into results, I just want to mention our methods. So this study was conducted in Rhinelander, Wisconsin at the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. We had 9 treatment combinations 3 water table depths. So a fully flooded treatment where the water table was at the soil surface, an intermediate flooded treatment where the water table depth was 14 centimeters below, and then a control group where the water table was 27 centimeters below. And then our light reduction treatments were 1 full sun treatment, 1 40% reduction, and 1 70% light reduction treatment. So we did other measurements than what I've listed here on my slide, but what I'll mention today is our photosynthesis measurements, our survival analysis, and our height growth measurements. And this is just a photo of what our field looked like with our shade tents and et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to show this collection of photos just to give you an idea of what our flooding treatments look like. So we simulated the flood in stock tanks for these seedlings. And you can just get a better idea of particularly what the fully flooded treatment looked like was what I thought was the most interesting one here. So before I dive into results, I want to mention that I'm not going to go into too much detail about survival today because overall we had a 94% survival rate for our seedlings. This could be due to the fact that it was just a 1-year study and they were nursery stock, so they could have come in with quite a few like sugar reserves and mineral reserves and things like that. So we didn't get a lot of mortality, so that wasn't the most telling of our response variables. But I will talk about height. So water table depth in particular had a really large effect on the height growth of these species. And I want to mention first that I'm not an expert graph maker and my axis titles are extremely small. So this is a fully flooded treatment. This is the intermediate flood, and that's the control group. So you can see with all of these species, some of them had little growth overall, but all of them had declining growth as you get higher and higher flood. Not a big shocker, right? But I do want to mention that bald cypress is the only one that I showed here that has a significant amount of growth in the fully flooded treatment. Are we shocked by this? Probably not. So again, just like something to really notice about this slide is that water table depth has had a significant effect on the height growth. In contrast, light reduction really didn't have much of an impact. So there's only one species on this slide, sycamore, that had changed its height growth depending on the light reduction treatment. And I will say too that even though I have a couple species pictured and a lot of them not pictured, these trends between like light reduction and water table depth, they hold for the other species as well. So I do want to mention too, when I go into photosynthesis, the reason why we looked at photosynthesis is because it's a good indicator of flooding stress in seedlings. So for instance, if I have a seedling that looks okay, but it has really low photosynthetic rate, it probably isn't going to last very long in the next couple of years. So that's why we looked at photosynthesis as a response variable. And once again, with water table depth, there's been a pretty significant impact. And again, as with height, as you increase in your flooding, as the water table gets closer to the surface, the lower the photosynthetic rate. Let's see. And it increases as we go from the maples to tamarack. But yeah, the most important piece of this slide again is that water table depth is a critical factor in determining the photosynthetic rate of these seedlings. And again, mirroring height, light reduction has had a very minimal impact. So that's like the main idea of this slide. River birch is the only one that had a significant impact of light reduction on photosynthetic rate. So this is my $1 million slide where I kind of grouped the seedlings according to, and this is the key point, response to water table depth. So this isn't including cold tolerance or flooding duration, or even I excluded light reduction in this slide as well, because it didn't really have too much of a role in the first year of these seedlings. So these categories are going to be, for bald cypress, for example, it did really well in its photosynthetic rates and stomatal conductance, transpiration, in all the flooding levels, including the fully flooded one. Whereas the ones in the moderate flood group, they didn't do so well in the fully flooded, but they did really well in terms of growth and gas exchange rates in the moderate flood, and so on and so forth. The well-drained soil one's pretty self-explanatory. And I do want to call attention to the fact that I highlighted with little stars the species that have high transpiration rates across water table depths. This is important because black ash has a really high transpiration rate at fully flooded levels, which controls the hydrology. And that's one of the key ecosystem functions that black ash plays in these wetlands. So if these species that have high transpiration rates should receive special consideration when choosing replacement species. So my main takeaways, one caveat for this study is that it's a one-year study. So it's definitely not the be all end all of, what species should be chosen. And, based on our results, managers should probably focus more on matching their replacement species to the hydrology or the water table depth conditions of their wetlands versus the light conditions. And then finally, I was gonna say that no silver bullet species exists. However, after Carrie Pike's talk, I'm thinking maybe that, resistant black ash is the silver bullet species. But that won't come around for a long time, I'm thinking. So anyways, and all of you could probably have come to this conclusion anyway on your own, but it's really best to probably try to choose a cohort of species. So just so you have the best chances possible to have successful regeneration in black ash wetlands. And thank you for listening. This is my email if anyone has questions after today.
We're gonna pivot to Zoom now for Charlie Flower. Let me call you up here, Charlie. Can you hear us loud and clear?
Yep.
Great. I guess I should stop sharing, huh? All right, feel free to share your slides and just begin when you're ready.
Let's see if I can get this in presentation mode. All right, that looks good. Let me know when you guys are ready there.
Yep, we see your first slide. Perfect.
Cool. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank you guys for joining this afternoon. My name is Charlie Flower, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the USDA Forest Service. And so the work that we'll be presenting today is kind of an amalgamation of studies. We'll kind of cover some synthesis of these studies findings and some insights for managing northern hardwoods in response to pest and pathogen outbreaks. So pest and pathogen outbreaks or pests and pathogens themselves are ubiquitous across forests in the Great Lakes region and beyond. As you can see here from the map on the right, unfortunately, these disturbances are expected to become, or they're pretty widespread here, as you can see on the right. And these disturbances are expected to become, more problematic in lockstep with future climate change simulations. So despite this increasing importance, there's still insufficient data documenting the nuances of forest responses to pests and pathogens. And these data gaps are particularly important because disturbance magnitude, severity, and frequency varies considerably by these disturbance agents. So these data gaps limit our abilities to improve management outcomes. So here we're gonna use the arrival of the invasive emerald ash borer, which has received pretty good introductions thus far, as the backdrop for studying responses. So we'll we'll reveal results from several experiments that can provide some management insights for northern hardwood forests. And so here, on this slide, we'll cover some impacts or some insights from some EAB permanent plot monitoring across northwestern Ohio. So in 2005, we installed 99 11.2 meter radius permanent plots across northwestern Ohio. And these were installed in green and black ash stands and monitored moving forward. So these systems are most analogous to your black ash stands in northern Minnesota. The image in the bottom center here depicts one of these sites in 2009 post EAB. So the results from these monitoring efforts indicate that most ash trees died several years following symptom onset. And equally interesting, these trees fell pretty shortly thereafter. Trees in the genera Acer, Ulmus, Populus, Quercus, and Caria exhibited the most rapid growth in tandem with this ash senescence. So you can see those results here on the bottom right. Obviously you can tell there from the map that we've got wider plots across the area. And so some of these, once we synthesize all these results, they'll be hopefully useful for forest managers in a variety of different systems. So the results from northwestern Ohio also suggest that residual trees respond quite rapidly. So the figure on the bottom left highlights the virtually immediate result of maple radial growth in conjunction with the EAB disturbance. At the ecosystem level, despite the compensatory growth of these residual trees, the EAB-induced ash mortality reduced forest productivity by upwards of 31%. And so the figure in the bottom center here, you can see the black bar represents ash productivity, which falls out over time, and the gray bar represents residual non-ash growth. So as you can see from that figure, that residual non-ash growth, really steps into the fold there to cover that net primary productivity. So if you look at the figure on the right as well, we can see that the severity of the reduction is non-linearly related to the initial basal area of ash in the stand. So once the majority of basal area of ash is impacted, the functionality of these systems falls off pretty quickly. So you can see there's this tipping point at about 60 to 70% basal area that these systems really lose their resilience. And so that's an important thought to kind of consider there moving forward. So obviously we know that ash succumbed pretty quickly to EAB. So what now? If management goals are focused on conservation, insecticides can be used to conserve high value ash trees or sensitive populations across the landscape. So a variety of insecticides have successfully been deployed to control EAB at the plot level, or at the tree level rather. Evidence suggests that these treatments are most successful when deployed before the canopy decline progresses beyond 50%. And obviously that necessitates the chemical distribution and functioning xylem. So that's kind of the caveat there. So we were approached by some collaborators on the Allegheny National Forest to help them understand ash decline and to deploy in situ conservation efforts on the forest. And so to this end, we conducted widespread monitoring and deployed repeated insecticide applications on a subset of ash trees across 27 permanent plots. We tracked the tree health and system response over time. And you can see here from this figure on the right, the trees that were treated successfully maintained their canopy health. And you can see that at the green symbols at the bottom. Untreated trees in close proximity to treated trees conferred some level of associational protection. You can see that in the yellow symbols. And when isolated ash trees not in close proximity to treated trees were untreated, obviously they continued to senesce over time. So although not present here or kind of presented here, biocontrols obviously represent useful agents to reduce EAB population densities. So moving forward, to kind of protect these systems in general, forest restoration efforts represent a good viable option for maintaining ecosystem resilience and functionality in the face of EAB and other pests and pathogens. So preemptive underplantings can be conducted at any juncture to stabilize these systems. So we have two primary restoration efforts underway on disturbed systems in Ohio. One of these is in an ash floodplain. Here's an image in the top right. You can see an elm planted in some saturated soils here next to a dead ash tree. We also have some non-native invasive plant infested riparian restoration spots in some urban areas in central Ohio. So needless to say, both the results of these studies kind of highlight the importance of light in the survival of planted material. It also kind of highlights some nuances associated with microtopography and herbivory that we've heard from here. So obviously those are significant considerations. Additionally, we've got an image here in the bottom center here that Dustin and Gwen provided from their work up in Rhinelander, where they conducted these ex situ flooding performance trials of trees in the northern hardwood systems to determine which species could be effectively utilized in these underplantings. Not surprisingly, they found that American elm, sycamore, river birch, silver maple, bald cypress, swamp white oak, and northern white cedar performed really well. So pivoting from the restoration activities, we use elm as one of the kind of primary species in these footprints because we're in the process of breeding better trees. So I co-work in NRS 16, which is a it focuses on breeding tolerant trees to pests and pathogens. And we're working on breeding, obviously, elm and ash, as you heard before. So Kathleen, Leela, and myself are, running point on the elm project with insights from Carrie Pike and Linda Haugen and a variety of other folks. And Jennifer Cook and her team run point on the ash tree propagation. And so both of these species obviously are well suited to these systems, and hopefully over time can be deployed back on the landscape. So we're currently enhancing our elm collections from the upper Midwest as well. So we hope to eventually outplant these materials and conduct disease inoculation trials on them, and then leave the material in the ground for seed orchards. So material could be collected and then outplanted on the landscape as needed. So this is kind of a shameful plug for if anybody knows of any large elms in the area over 20 inches in diameter at breast height, please go ahead and contact us below. You can either reach out to Linda Haugen, myself, or load it into the Survivor Elm database. And really quickly, kind of wrapping this up because I only had a 5-minute slot, I think. But so what in the world does this? What in the world can we kind of glean from this study or this presentation? So a brief recap: pests and pathogens will continue to impact forest landscapes. Improving our understanding of forest land responses is important because it enables better predictive capability, which can aid forest managers in their goal of maintaining forest health. So, as we've presented here, once EAB arrives, it can cause rapid ash tree mortality. Such mortality can cause significant shifts in these riparian systems, both to soil biogeochemistry, kind of standing carbon stocks, and hydrology, as we've heard here today. Some of the preemptive underplanting of the most sensitive systems with appropriate material can improve survival and maintain these ecosystem resilience. So then obviously we've got the list of species that Dustin and Gwen kind of produced for us. So in summer, or kind of, I'd like to acknowledge the Toledo and Metro Parks, the Oak Openings Metro Parks, the Manton Foundation for funding, the Washington office and Region 9 of State and Private Forestry, Nature Conservancy, the Finger Lakes National Forest, the Chippewa National Forest, and the Conner River Seed Orchard, and a multitude of technicians over the course of the years. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Charlie. And you'll be able to stick around until about 2:20 to answer some questions at the end. Great. Next up is there you go. All right. Keith's coming up. I need to share the screen.
Familiar?
Clicker. Hey.
All right. You're excellent. Thank you. Sure, I know what I'm doing here. Good afternoon. My name is Keith Jacobson. I'm a part-time guy with the Department of Natural Resources. At this point in my life, I am back on what's called a post-retirement option, working part-time on silvicultural case studies for the department after about a 37-year career all over the place doing all kinds of stuff. So I was fortunate early in my field career to work on a couple of sites similar to the ones that we saw earlier in the upper Mississippi River bottomland system. And today's presentation is about those. We're going to kind of rip through the first few slides. It's 35 plus years and 15 minutes. So set the table just briefly and then spend a little more time on some takeaways and a few musings and thoughts for the future. And I would note, since we are going to rip through these things pretty quickly, that these case studies are both available in detail on the Great Lakes Silviculture website. So the case study team, we've got several more bottomland hardwood Mississippi River ones in the works, but these ones are completed and they are a retrospective study. So we didn't know what case studies were 35 years ago when this is going on. So we've been piecing these back together over the last couple of years, going in, finding out what conditions are now and trying to look through records and doing the best we can to piece together what happened over the years silviculturally. So my co-authors on this study, Michelle Martin, who is with us virtually today, has been a partner in every sense of the word in the last couple of years as we've worked on case studies, terrific to work with and a great resource for the department. She works in the central region on our ecological classification program and silviculture program. And there you see also Mike Wachholz and Chad Gellner, two of our excellent field foresters down out of our Lake City office who have been working in this system for a number of years now and trying to figure things out. So the problem statement is that there's a lot of there's quite a bit of acreage of this type of bottomland hardwood forest in the Mississippi River bottomlands. A lot of it is at or beyond biological maturity. So there's a lot of work to be done out here, regenerating these areas to forested condition to try to maintain forested condition. But it's been, and I think challenging is an understatement, it's been very challenging to consistently regenerate these stands. It's been a tough nut to crack. And a giant challenge, as has been mentioned earlier, is that it's been awfully wet the last 35 years in comparison to the previous 35 to that. So a little more background. This is, we're covering two case studies, very similar, not quite the same, variety of silvicultural actions over the last 35 plus years. And the focus that we took on these case studies is, as has been observed earlier, when we were walking through these areas, looking at how they did and didn't regenerate mostly on these sites, doggone it, there were places where they did regenerate. There were patches where it really did take, and why here? It was not evident, just taking a look at them, that there was nothing that we could figure out easily that would indicate to us and help inform what we did in the future, why these darn things did it right here and not over here in some very similar looking area. And so we decided to look at three things: elevation, of course, that has to have some impact, right? We figured reed canary grass competition, a very tough competitor on some of these sites, and soils. And so that's what we focused on as we worked on these case studies. And so where were they? In between Hastings and Red Wing, actually on the Vermilion River, but the Mississippi River system right next to the Mississippi River. And there you see where they are. And you see aerial photos, they're not the same scale, so I apologize for that. This is actually a bigger site, about 83 acres worth. And this is about 31 acres, and this is a 2019, these are 2019 aerial photos of the site and the sites, I should say. And they're very much southern floodplain forest, dominated by silver maple, flat, flooded almost every year, often for a good portion of the growing season. And that's what they are. So that's a lot of words on pre-treatment stand condition. Maybe I just focus you on the timber sale appraisal volumes, and there's been several timber sales on this 83 acre site, but this was the first one in 1983. It gives you a sense that silver maple just dominated these sites very much. And there was a decent amount of green ash way back when in 83 on this site and a bit elsewhere. And then a smattering of cottonwood and American elm and black willow. And the DNR's goal for acreage in this area, bottomland hardwood forest, is to maintain as much as possible by regenerating mature stands. And there you see a couple examples. And so silvicultural prescriptions, you can see, a number of things have been done over the years. Different types of harvests on different portions of these things. They've both been planted, this one several times, and with differing results. And so in the 31 acre stand, by the way, BH stands for bottomland hardwoods, very sophisticated coding system for our case studies, BH1 and 2. So on BH1, the 31 acre stand, there were about 13 acres of thinning set up, kind of improvement harvest on a part of the stand where that was possible. There was some pole size stuff that looked like it was good enough shape that it would hang in there if we did a thin and just open up the crowns a bit. And so we did that on about 13 acres, and about 18 acres was clear cut with reserves. And there were a variety of different kinds of harvests, a couple thins, a clear cut with reserves, and a seed tree as recent as 2019 on the larger site. So back to BH1. So the thinning portion worked quite well. It really did. And so in that area, the trees are in great shape, great health and vigor. The crowns have filled back in, and it worked better than I thought it did, in fact, frankly. So very nicely done. And those trees now are really at probably biological maturity where the thin was done. For the portions treated with large gap and clear cut with reserve harvest, the 18 acres, there have been patches, there have been portions that actually regenerated pretty nicely. Most of it has not. And so there's still work to be done in there, but there are definitely patches that regenerated silver maple. And why was that? BH2, similar, probably less patches of good regeneration. On part of the site nearest the Vermilion River, got some great green ash and elm regeneration. Yeah, not gonna cut it for a long-term forested condition with EAB and of course Dutch elm. But so we'll keep working on those. But the rest of the site mostly has not regenerated adequately. But there are some patches where it has. And so why the heck was that? And so again, there you see those photos. And so for understory plants, variable, but most part common wetland, native wetland plants. Michelle tells me that's what it is, and I believe her. I have some familiarity as myself. Variable, and you can see some variability here. And I would say wherever there was reed canary before the treatment began, there's reed canary now. And one of the things we found was, and it was surprising to me, there wasn't a lot of movement on that. There wasn't a lot of encroachment into new areas of heavy reed canary. I was surprised by that. I was expecting to see more. And this is a lot of cost and revenue information. If you want the details, again, you can go look at the library site. But basically, you're going to find, similar as was mentioned, you're going to be investing some money in these sites if you're going to get them to take over time. And so shifting to key findings, we looked at elevation, and so these colors relate to, there we go. Elevation. Michelle Martin made these graphics. And so you see these dots where these aren't all the good patches of silver maple, but they're selected ones that we pick to look at and assess. And so you see, well, there's different elevations where these picked up. Some of this is pretty low. The darker blue, and into blue is the lower areas into the green, and then the higher areas are the yellow and orange, and similar on this site. So you can see, is it better to be high than low? Yes, it is. But is that all there is going on? No, there's some good patches that took off in the low areas, and we were surprised to see that. It also, just to the naked eye, there was nothing, there was no real rise you could discern out there. They seemed pretty level to the immediate surrounding area. So very interesting to me. I would have expected a little more distinct difference here. So better to be high than low, sure, but that's not all that's going on. There's more to it than that. You can absolutely have success on some of the lower areas. Reed canary grass impacts. Reed canary clearly a major impediment to regeneration on some other bottomland sites, and even in some places on these sites where it was established before treatment. But it wasn't the case on a large majority of these sites. That wasn't the big issue that was causing things to not happen here, not be regenerated. Again, a surprise to me. I would have expected more encroachment from Reed canary, more of the area for that to have been a big issue. But on most of the area, that was not the limiting factor or the major limiting factor. And impacts of soil on regeneration success. I'm sorry. And so Michelle Martin did 3 soil pits on different spots out there, some where there was good regeneration, some where there wasn't. And that is, we weren't able to discern any real major takeaways from that. But that doesn't mean there isn't more to be learned there. We think that would be well worth spending some time on. The soils do vary a great deal, just even a few feet away. You can imagine, the annual floods and the shifting deposition of soil based on residual vegetation patterns and topography changes. The soil can be pretty different over just a short geographic area, just a few feet. And so is that one of the things that's really determining or driving why these patches set up where they do? More information needed there. And so some takeaways we'd offer. And here over in the corner in unfortunately small picture, you see at least one of those, a small patch, quarter acre, whatever. Exactly what we'd love to see. There's 15 to 20-year-old silver maple in there that has clearly taken off since we started working in there. And why did it choose to set up here and not just outside the picture? That's a question yet to be resolved. But certainly we know growing season flooding was a major challenge to successful regeneration. As was mentioned earlier, it's not particularly difficult to get, it's not difficult at all to get silver maple and other bottomland hardwood seedlings to establish. They do that almost every year, but they get flooded out by growing season flooding in at least most years of the last 35. So that's the major challenge. You need to get a few years of where they're not underwater for a couple of years in a row. You never know ahead of time when those are going to happen. Elevation appears to have a complex relationship to regeneration success. It's not as simple as higher, lower you can't be successful. So more study needed there. And then reed canary grass didn't, at least on these sites, encroach very much, at least a heavy reed canary grass, where it was opened up after we started doing silvicultural work in here. Certainly more research on soils impacts is needed. And we would offer the same as was mentioned earlier, patience and persistence is required here. Really, if you're expecting to reforest these sites in 2 years after you go in there, you are likely going to be very disappointed. So you got to stick with it. And so how can it inform work in these floodplain forest sites? And again, just offer some thoughts that there's a lot of work to be done here. And so we need to stick with these things. There is risk of loss of forested condition by doing nothing on these stands. They do break up over time. And so I would offer that it would be really important to ensure that you are using available resources for development of your silviculture prescription. So talking to our compadres in the Corps, other folks who have worked in these, our own excellent staff that have worked in these systems. There are no shortage of ideas and things to try, and so there are definitely a number of things to not do that we've learned. So definitely lean on those folks. The best silviculture options are not certain. It would be a good place to try some things. All those options will have challenges with marketability, access, not to mention trying to manage the level of light that goes in. But all of those will have challenges. There's no silver bullet. All would be, a number of things would be worth a try. I'm excited to try some shelter wood, which we'll have to find a special site that's pretty accessible and has some decent wood for a couple entries. But things we see indicate that that might be worth a try or another try. Plan on continuing efforts for years and probably significant expense. And additional studies will be helpful on a number of things, but for sure, optimal microhabitat conditions for establishing silver maple. We find where there are down logs or nurse logs or even a single residual tree, sometimes even where there's reed canary, boy, that can alter the conditions enough where we get a little more establishment there than others. Layering as a component of regeneration. We'd love to look a little bit underneath and see the origin of some of those trees that are in those patches. Was there an initial layering effort there, and have they come off of that? Not sure, probably some of that, but not sure how much. And the impact of site locations with especially heavy annual seed establishments. So as you'd expect in these areas, there are places where more seedlings than other areas, or more seeds do come to rest after flooding, and more seedlings get established annually. Is that maybe part of what's driving where there's success and where there isn't compared to those other areas? Not sure. No shortage of other things. So that was a lightning 15 minutes of 35 efforts. And there's my contact information. Love to chat with anyone that has an interest or wants to know more. You can reach out. Thanks.
All right, and then just one last talk, and then we'll head into our Q&A portion.
All right, so not so drastic as 35 years into 15 minutes. I'm going to boil down a master's thesis into 5. So is my volume okay? Okay, so I'm Erin Bergen. I'm a master's student at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and my project is on population differentiation in phenology and hydrologic impacts of 2 Quercus species. So the trees that we plant stay in one spot for a very long time, and their long-term success is dependent on environmental conditions, which are not rooted in place. It's getting warmer, especially up north, and our precipitation patterns are changing to more of a drought and deluge situation than a steady supply. Tree species do migrate on their own, one seedling at a time, or we make choices based on our goals for restoration and replanting, and we choose what species to plant. There's already been work done on which tree species are projected to do well in climate change. And a lot of people are considering moving away from what has always been there and starting to think about what may succeed in the future. But it need not stop there. So populations of trees are actually distinct from each other in genetic and physiological traits. They have local adaptations that give them advantages depending on stable climate conditions. So when climate shifts, those advantages may be lost. There is a chance then that perhaps not only species, but also populations may be a tool for us for choosing what to plant for restoration and replanting. And then once you make that choice, what about the impacts? So it's not just planting a single tree. That tree's in a forest. That forest has resource cycles, and trees may heavily impact them, especially in the case of water. So one of the main tree uses of water is transpiration. And my study is comparing 2 species of trees that are projected to do very well in Minnesota, bur oak and northern red oak. And I also am comparing 2 populations within those species. So shown here is a map of Minnesota. There are static seed sourcing zones. And we took seeds from zone 105 in the south, that's red, and zone 104 in the north, blue. And we planted them side by side in 2013 in zone 104. So they've been growing for a while. And I'm comparing now 4 tree types, 2 species, 2 populations, for their phenology or biological timing and their hydrology or water use. Just some highlights. So as expected, species are different in their biological timing and their water use. More than that though, the populations are distinctly different as well. So this first graph here shows the days of leaf retention in a growing season, or the canopy retention. And then each type of tree has its own bar. The southern populations for both species had leaves for longer. The second graph shows transpiration by species. Bur oak, typically a savanna species, it makes an early investment in transpiration and then tapers off as its normal habitat would dry out. Red oaks you can find in typically wetter environments. They ramp up transpiration over the course of a growing season. There's also differences in population water use. So just based on this first graph of canopy retention, these types of trees have different chances at using water. So long as there are leaves, you can transpire. And then if we combine species level transpiration and population level differences in canopy retention, the overall chances or the overall water use for each of these types of trees are different. This is an ongoing master's thesis. I'm still running analyses. There are population level differences in transpiration rate as well. So the trees that we are choosing for restoration and replanting are hopefully going to persist for as long as we need them, maybe longer than our own lives, but that depends on climatic conditions, which are changing and will continue to change. So my study has proven that populations of trees, not just species, are different in their biological timing and climate suitability. They're also different in their water use, which has ecosystem impacts. And so we may be able to use populations, not just species, as a tool. There may current seed sourcing policies in Minnesota don't really allow for assisted population migration, but I think this is a pretty strong case for reconsidering those static seed zones and starting to move towards more adaptive forestry practices. If we are informed and deliberate with the choices we make for our replanting and our restoration, hopefully the forests we grow continue to be productive long into the future. That's all I got for now.
You can stay up there actually, and we'll have all the speakers from this block come up and then just kind of cluster around here. And we will, oh, thanks, Eli. Perfect. All right, so the first question is for Andy. What type of logging equipment and other machinery do you use in the floodplains, and how do you get it to your sites?
Well, generally, we don't get it to our sites. So I gave you 2 case studies that were about 10 years apart. We've got one more timber cell that we've marked since then. These sites are next to impossible to get to if you don't have road access. So the Pool 3 site was a skidder operation, and they actually drove the skidder out over about a half mile of ice to get it to the island, and then they skidded logs out with a pickup truck. So it's challenging. The site prep treatments, most of the time we're doing with bobcats, skid steers, a little bit smaller equipment that's a little bit easier to get out, but it's still very expensive to get those out to islands if we don't have actual road access.
Gwen, did the flooding duration stay constant over time in the treatments? What water table changes can occur seasonally, with drawdown occurring later in the summer for the somewhat drier sites? So what's your takeaway for species diversity?
Yeah, so we actually there's multiple parts to this study, and one of the parts that we did in 2020 actually looked at flooding duration. So we held the water table constant and then looked at flooding duration. But for 2021, the study that I talked about today, we did hold all of the water tables constant. And then we also, we changed the water table depth and we held the duration constant. So all of the water table depths were applied for 15 weeks. So taken together, those 2 experiments will tell us more about how species respond to duration and intensity of flooding. But it was true that for the study that I described today, we didn't do any sort of drawdowns or anything like that.
Andy, we are planting larger root production method saplings on floodplains to try to overcome the unpredictable hydrologic regime. It's expensive and still comes with risk. Can you speak to the cost of the site prep treatments?
Sure. This is, something we think about a lot too. So generally speaking, none of this is cheap, but our herbicide treatments tend to run like $1,000 an acre per treatment, which is fairly expensive. We haven't actually gotten equipment out a lot on these islands because a lot of times you're paying an upfront mobilization cost of $20,000 to $30,000 just to get a bobcat out. When you're on areas that are accessible by road, that's much more like $100 to $200 an acre. When we're generally figuring our costs, we figure $2,000 to $3,000 an acre for the site prep and natural regen treatments. For bare root plantings, we figure $3,000 to $4,000, sometimes $5,000 an acre in order to do everything that we need to do. And we've really debated about large containerized seedlings versus bare root seedlings versus natural regen, because the challenge with planting a few large seedlings is you don't really recreate a natural floodplain forest condition. You plant trees in a floodplain, but it doesn't really, you don't get that density that you do with a natural regen treatment. So we've really been trying to think about how we can combine natural regen to get most of our density and then a little bit of planting to get that a little bit more diversity mixed in.
And I think, Aaron, I stopped the program, let's find that. How many individual seed sources were collected within each population? And do you think that a wide range of genetic variability within each population is captured?
This is actually an interesting facet of those static seed zones. The way that this is set up is they actually bin every contributed seed from each seed zone. So the planters, they give people money for bringing them seeds, but they could collect all of their seeds from a single oak tree. They could be spreading out. A lot of people are very secretive about their sources because they're making money off of getting these seeds. And then the DNR bins them all as just that zone's group of seeds. So it's very hard for us to actually get provenance in each of the seeds we're dealing with, which is, I think, one of the other flaws of the system.
Charlie, I'm hoping that you can speak more about the associational resistance of non-treated trees having some protection.
Yeah, so sorry, I got kids coming home from school in the background. So yeah, I mean, basically what we did there is we inoculated, I want to say it was like 20 trees in each plot to form like a base of, of inoculated trees. And then the proportion of non-treated trees in the plot, varied basically between like 10 and 90%. And so we have a really good gradient of, proportion of trees treated. And so we, basically we're really looking at the effect of, how well does the tolerance or resistance, or not tolerance or resistance, but the canopy condition hold up in the, the non-treated trees in those plots. And it, to date, it seems to hold up well. I mean, we've treated now, I think 3 times since 2015. So we have a 2-year retreatment cycle. We're treating at the moderate rate. These are kind of, it's a mixed woodlands. So, you've got reasonably, good variability in elevation and terrain. And yeah, so we're hoping that the material continues to hold up. We've had some failures, obviously associated with some of the inoculations themselves and wounding. But beyond that, it seems like a viable option, at least preliminarily. It's tough to say, after 5-6 years of treatment, how long that can really hold up. But it does seem like EAB has ripped through most of the Allegheny. And so, it's the fact that, our trees still remain healthy is a pretty good testament to at least the process in some capacity. It's probably obviously not effective in, super high densities, but again, if your goal is to, conserve genetic diversity of, unique populations as well, it could, have some value in that regard.
Thank you. Andy, in your experience, do you feel it is necessary to combine both the mechanical, such as tillage treatment, with the herbicides to control reed canary grass? How do the soils hold up?
Anecdotally, it does seem like mechanical scarification, soil scarification does seem to improve the seed bed a little bit. I think gets seed down into that soil a little bit more, but in a lot of cases, all we can do is the chemical site prep, and we've had we've had some success doing that. The soil, the soil is interesting. It's real wet, at least on the higher elevation areas. It's very wet in the spring, but by later in the summer, the sites are actually a lot of the sites are fairly workable. Once you start getting to lower elevations, it never really dries out enough to do anything. But, and the other challenge is that it could be workable in one, quarter of an acre, and then you go 100 feet in another direction. It's not. So, there's variability in how easy it is to do the sort of tillage treatment. So I think that the chemical site prep really is critical, and then mechanical is probably just a cherry on the top that, increases your likelihood of success just a little bit.
Aaron, based on your assessment of red oak and bur oak, what other native tree species are you most interested in examining for population level differences in phenology, et cetera?
Right, so my project started in 2013. It's a cooperation between the Nature Conservancy and the University of Minnesota Duluth. So they actually have planted alongside these oak trees white pines from Michigan and from Minnesota. So there's already a framework in place for us to start more population comparisons in white pine. But we do I think that it's important that we start looking at this across most of the important species that we have and are expected to thrive in this area, because we like to plant in cohorts. So if I were to move directly to something else, I would start with white pine. But one of my favorite trees around here are maples, so I might look to look at what maples next.
Sure. Gwen, how did the replacement species compare to black ash seedlings in your study under moderate and severe flood simulating conditions?
So it may not come as a shock to you all that the nurseries are not growing black ash. So we couldn't get black ash as a comparative seedling in our studies. So we weren't able to make a direct comparison. But, so I guess that's really the answer to the question. You could surmise that black ash is the best suited to this site. So it could do the best under those conditions. But yeah, we didn't have a black ash control in our study.
And did time of year in your experiment, thinking about sunlight strength and phenology, correlate with generalized seasonal flooding timelines that these trees would experience in situ?
Yeah, so they were conducted during the growing season that these trees would experience in upper Wisconsin and Minnesota. And it was all done outside for this year. So I believe that this would have followed the same kind of sunlight strength that they would experience in situ. Yeah, the flooding was a little bit more simplified, like I was saying, in order to get after the intensity and the duration separately. But I think otherwise it should match. Yeah.
Andy, with high site prep costs and only episodic success, extensive management sounds challenging. You hinted at a more intensive approach, planting a small number of larger trees. Do you plan to test this further?
Yeah, so a couple pieces to that. So I have to put the caveat on that my whole experience on the river is in the wettest 5 years that we've had in recorded history. And so just because things didn't work the last 5 years doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be as unpredictable in the next, we could have 15 years of lower water levels. And so I'm not sure what to say about the unpredictability and unreliability of that, although the 35-year data over the last 35 years isn't promising. That said, it's really a trade-off between, like I mentioned before, do we want to establish trees at densities that are natural densities in these floodplain stands, or do we want to just establish trees? And we kind of tend to shoot for about an 8x8 spacing, about almost 700 trees an acre. That sort of meets our stocking targets for established trees. But by the time we plant even bare roots at that spacing and do follow-up vegetation control and herbivory control, whether it's tree tubes or deer repellent or whatever it happens to be, we're actually exceeding the cost for those site prep treatments with those repeated planting treatments. So we've really been, again, thinking of kind of hybridizing the two, really focusing on getting density from natural regen where we can, and then much more intensive, but much lower numbers of tree seedlings. And another thing that we've been working on with Marcelo Miller Campione is kind of starting to get into these intermediate density stands where the canopy hasn't broken up completely yet. And so there's not as much vegetative competition. You've got a little bit more shade controlling the vegetation, and whether we can start getting seedlings established in that kind of a condition at a much lower cost than getting into these really dense reed canary grass or nettle patches. So the answer is, in a very roundabout way, is yes, but there's like he said, a lot of thought that still needs to go into the process.
And I just add, the Lake City Foresters, our folks have tried several of these, and one of which is about 3.5 acres this fall of large root production method seedlings. And so the plan is to fold those into the case study moving ahead and monitor those. We've got some nice records on what happened there and exactly what's done at establishment time. And we'll be able to track those over time and hopefully answer that question better in the future.
Thank you. Aaron, has your group considered coordinating with existing tree breeding programs like FDIC? They have many plantings with no provenance for several species.
Yeah, and this actually kind of gets into the next part as well. This project was started with an emphasis on considering the existing static seed zones in Minnesota and examining them for whether they still worked or not. They were made in the 1960s. And so the emphasis wasn't so much on finding viable sources of these seeds, but seeing if the existing structure still works. So the point was that if we took these seeds from zones that already existed and we compared them side by side, were there differences just that we could detect within the existing structure of the system. My advisor, Julie Ederson, does have a lot of ongoing projects with comparing the growing practices of different seed sources, and they do work with a number of different companies that are in charge of bringing native seeds or deal with growing native seeds. It's just for this project, we're actually focusing on the framework in Minnesota for this policy. And it is very exciting that they're re-examining it. It's just when it started, it wasn't being re-examined. And right now, because it isn't finalized, I didn't feel like I could say that they are working or that it is changed until I know what the changes are.
Well, we've got you. Just a comment that it's not entirely accurate that current seed transfer policy prevents the opportunity for long distance or adjacent seed zone assisted migration projects. Policy revision to support this type of work is underway.
Exactly. So it's going to change. I'm not sure how though, so I can't speak to how it affects my project or how I interpret my project just yet.
Andy, what is your primary reforestation revenue sources if timber sale revenue is not it?
Well, one of the benefits of, I work for one of the few agencies that actually has reliable budgets. One of the benefits of working for DOD and working for an agency that does dredging and builds infrastructure is that $1 million budget is a drop in the bucket compared to other budgets. So all of our reforestation costs just come from our congressionally apportioned funding. We don't need to rely on timber income in order to pay for reforestation costs, which is, I certainly feel very blessed and lucky to be in an agency where we have that opportunity.
Are there partnerships then that you do with the DNR and other places that maybe are a little bit more restricted?
We have a challenge. Well, yes. So there are a couple big restoration programs on the river. There's one, the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program has been in place since the mid 80s. And every year there are a few multi-million-dollar projects that are collaborative projects between the Corps of Fish and Wildlife Service and the state agencies, and occasionally some other partners. Those up until the last few years have generally focused more on aquatic habitat restoration, but forest restoration on the river has become a much higher priority for partner agencies over the last few years. So that's a really big opportunity. Audubon, Minnesota has actually, they have a full-time forester working on the Upper Mississippi River Refuge, and they have been able to access a lot of Lessard Sam's funding to do work on the Mississippi River. And so that's been another source that's helped some of the DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service be able to do some of their work.
Great. Well, we have a couple more questions, but we're out of time here at 2:20. So thank you all for